Okay friends, one of the first things we have to do to get started on our job is to safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the front wheel's off the ground. After that, if you have hubcaps, go ahead and remove those. Typically I just grab onto it and you can pull it off. If you have a hard time with that, go ahead and use a pry bar and gently pry it. Next, we're going to use a 21mm socket to remove all 4 of our lug nuts. Remove your wheel. Now the next thing we're going to pay attention to is the caliper itself. We're going to have to be able to push back the piston that's inside this area directly back this way. To do that, I'm going to use a small pry bar, carefully get in between this area of the caliper and gently pry up against the rotor. At the same time as this is happening, you can see the slider pins making their way in. At this point, it feels as though it's stopped. I can wiggle this around. Let's continue on to our 2 slider bolts. I'll use my 14mm on this. Just going to leave this one loose. We'll go ahead and remove this one. Now we can remove the pair. Inspect both of your bolts, set them aside. Now at this point, we're going to go ahead and grab onto a bracket that looks like this, or even a bungee cord, whatever you might happen to have. Go ahead and remove the caliper, inspect it, make sure you don't see any fluid in this area. Assuming it looks good, we're going to go ahead and hang this, making sure that we're putting no pressure on our flex hose. Let's move along to removing our brake pads. Carefully get in between the pad and the rotor and separate the 2. Now we can go ahead and turn the wheel a little bit and have access to our 2 caliper bracket bolts. Use a 17mm to remove the pair. Leave that in there a couple good threads. Fully remove the second. Remove both bolts, inspect them, then remove your caliper bracket. Set it aside. Now it's going to be time to remove your brake rotor. Sometimes you can just grab onto them, give them a little wiggle, and they'll fall right off. If it doesn't want to, put one of your lug nuts back on here, and then gently tap it with a hammer from both sides until it does. Remove your rotor. With the rotor out of the way, it's going to be time to quickly inspect this and clean the hub right directly where the rotor is going to mount against. So essentially all along this flat area. Now that I have the majority of the hub surface cleaned up, we also want to make sure that we pay attention to the area in between the stud and the hub. All in here is very important to clean as well. Typically you can do that with a wire brush or even a tool that looks like this. Whichever way, just clean it out. Now it's going to be time to strip down the caliper bracket. There's several things on here that we're going to remove. Let's start by removing our caliper tins. Before we go ahead and remove them though, you want to pay attention because one of the tins on each of your caliper brackets is going to have this extra tab on either side. So when we go to replace these tins, you want to make sure you put it on the exact same side of the bracket. If you can't remember for some reason, just go ahead and mark the bracket with a crayon or whatever you might happen to have. Pop that right off of there. You can see both those tabs. Do the same to this one. We can set that aside. Now the next thing we're going to want to remove is the caliper slider pins. To remove these, I'm just going to use a small pocket screwdriver and I'm going to carefully get in between this area just to start separating the 2 while being very careful not to damage the boot in any way. After that, just go ahead and slide the caliper pin out of there and set it down on the corresponding side that you removed it from. Next, let's go ahead and remove the caliper slider boots. When you look at these, you're going to see that one end is kind of smooth on this end, and then over here it has some ridges. So just keep that in mind for when we go to reinstall these. Typically, you can just grab onto it and give it a little tug. If you can't, just stick something in between there and carefully separate it. Now that we have the caliper slider boots off of there, let's carefully inspect them. You're going to give them a little squeeze and a little tug just to make sure that they're not torn or worn in any way. Also, you want to make sure they're soft and pliable. This needs to be able to go in and out like that. Aside from that, let's go ahead and use a rag and wipe it down. Go ahead and run that around on the inside there. Inspect the inside of the boot. Do the same to the other. All right, now let's move along to cleaning up our slider pins. The most important areas are, of course, the area that goes inside of the caliper bracket and then all the way up to where my index and thumb is. That's exactly the area where the boot needs to ride, so you're going to want to make sure that you thoroughly clean this area inside the groove as well. So clean out this area and fully clean up the shaft. Once it's clean, just go ahead and thoroughly inspect it. Make sure it's still in good order. After that, go ahead and clean up the other one. All right, this other slider pin looks great. So now let's talk about cleaning up the bracket. The areas on the bracket that you want to pay attention to are, of course, the slider ports, which run inside this area here. You have 2 of those. And then also you want to pay attention to all the areas that we removed those tins from. So we're going to go ahead and clean those up real quick. When you're cleaning your slider ports, you of course also want to make sure that you clean up this ridge along here where that boot's going to ride. Super important. Just use our bore brush for that. Take a peek inside there, make sure it doesn't look like it's damaged. This one looks okay. All along here is nice and clean. We'll do the same to the other slider port. All right, so now that we have both of those cleaned up, let's continue on to those areas where I talked about that had the tins. We're going to make sure we clean all these flat areas here and, of course, inside each of these grooves. Inspect the areas, make sure it's not corroded or damaged in any way. Do the same on the other side. All right, so now at this point, I've cleaned up all 4 corners over here, so I'm just going to use some high temperature caliper grease, and I'm going to carefully go along all those areas that I just cleaned up. This is going to help with vibration dampening and noise reduction. Now it's going to be time to put on our tins. You remember when I talked to you when we were removing them, one of the tins that you're going to use for each side has these extra tabs on it. We're going to go ahead and put that on the exact same side as when we removed it from originally. Go ahead and slide that right in, and then press right inside the center area here to lock it in. After that, give it a little wiggle to make sure it's secure, and then do the same on the other side of the bracket. Let's continue on with that caliper grease. The next thing I'm going to do is come right along this slider port. Generally, I like to put just a tiny bit right inside the very beginning here, but I also want to make sure that I get up along this outer lip, the area that we cleaned up. We'll do the same on both. And next we're going to take some more of that high temp grease, and we're going to go ahead and coat the entire shaft of this slider right here. Once we've done that, continue on all the way up into that groove closest to my index finger and thumb. Now it's going to be time for the slider boot. When we took this off, you remember that you can see the one with the little nubs on there? We want that area up against the caliper bracket. So I'm just going to take this, slide it right onto the caliper slider, and slide that right into the caliper bracket. Now you want to inspect it and make sure that the boot's sitting up onto both of those grooves. After that, go ahead and move this around, up and down, around and around. This is going to work in the grease so no moisture or debris can make its way inside, and then do the same to the other slider. At this point, the caliper bracket looks perfect. Let's continue on back over at the vehicle. Now what we're going to do is continue on with some copper never sees just along this hub surface, right where that rotor is going to sit. Now it's going to be time to install our brand new rotor. Go ahead and slide it over that hub. At this point, I always take one of my lug nuts and I'm just going to start it on here all the way up against the rotor to hold it in place. Now we can go ahead and put on our caliper bracket. Let's go ahead and slide this right into place. And now we'll take two of our caliper bracket bolts with some red thread locker. Go ahead and start them in there by hand. We'll snug them up and then we'll torque them to manufacturer's specification. Torque each of these to 62 foot-pounds. Now it's going to be time to take care of the caliper itself. We're going to push in this piston using our caliper compression tool. I'm just going to come right inside here and then gently push this back until it's in its fully seated position. After that, inspect the boot that's around the piston. Just make sure it's not pushed out in any way. We're just going to go ahead and wipe this down. And then we'll use a little bit more of that high temperature caliper grease, and we're going to go right along this caliper piston here, and then along the backside of each of these two ears. Once again, this is going to help with vibration dampening and noise reduction. Now it's time for our brake pads. The areas that you're going to pay attention to is you want to make sure you have these two wear indicators facing up. The reason why they have to face up is because you have these tabs on the tins. Those tabs need to slide into the hole that you can see on each of these wear indicators. For putting in the pads, I'm just going to go ahead and grab onto this little tin right here and slide it right into that wear indicator. After that, we're going to take both ears of the pad and slide it into the caliper bracket. Once you have it in there, you're going to want to try to hold onto this pad because it's going to want to try to push out. That's pretty much what this tab is supposed to do. I'm going to go ahead and do the same exact thing to the outer pad. All right, now once they're in, we're just going to continue holding these. Go ahead and grab onto the caliper and put it right over the top. Turn these. Now let's take those two caliper slider bolts. We'll put them right in here. Once you get them both started, go ahead and bottom them out, and then we'll torque these to 32 foot-pounds. Let's go ahead and remove that lug nut and then prepare to grab the wheel. Now at this point, we're going to go ahead and start on all four of our 21mm lug nuts. We'll bottom these out and then we're going to torque them crisscross to 83 foot-pounds. Now with the wheel safely back down on the ground, we can torque these to the 83 foot-pounds with our 21mm socket. Assuming you have a hubcap, go ahead and put that on now. You want to make sure that you line up the valve stem hole with the valve stem on the wheel. Double check to make sure it's completely secure. Okay friends, we got one side of the brakes done. What's left to do now? Now you're going to do the exact same thing on the other side of the vehicle. Make sure you torque everything down. After that, come under the hood and double check your brake fluid. Make sure it's full to the top, pump up that brake pedal, and take it for a road test. Thanks for watching.